How do you improve listening ability as quickly as possible? Are there any strategies to deal with rapid speech? And how many times should you listen before using a transcript? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to answer reader and listener questions about improving listening comprehension in Mandarin. This episode also coincides with two other things. First, we have the start of February's listening challenge. So if you want to improve your Mandarin through daily practice and friendly competition, please check the link in the show notes and go to challenges.hackingchinese.com. These challenges are completely free to join and are just meant to help you invest a little bit more time than you normally do. And for listening comprehension, time is extremely important. The more you engage with Chinese, the more you will learn. The second thing I want to mention is that my course, The Fluent Listener, Navigating Spoken Mandarin Like a Fish in Water, is open for registration again. Listening is the most important skill and the best way to download the Chinese language into your brain, as it were, so take this opportunity and check out my course. The Fluent Listener will be open for registration until February 15th, but if you listen to this in the future or if the course is closed when you get there, you can always sign up for the waiting list and I'll let you know when the course opens again. Okay, with those two announcements out of the way, let's turn to your questions about listening comprehension. As usual, I've picked 3 questions that I'm going to answer here, and if you have any questions about listening comprehension or indeed any other aspect of learning Mandarin, you can send an email to editor@hackingchinese.com and I might cover it in an upcoming Q&A. To summarize, we have 3 questions. One is from Don about how many times to listen before using a transcript. The second is from Cassandra, who wants to know how to quickly get from B2, some kind of upper intermediate level, to C1, which is an advanced level. Then finally we have Charles, who wants to know how to understand Chinese people when they speak so quickly. So let's start with Don's question, which is a direct follow-up from a previous Q&A, episode 210, where I said that you are supposed to listen before you read. And I basically said that if you use written support, you should not use the written support right away, but should give yourself ample opportunity to listen before you read the transcript. All this assumes that improving listening comprehension is your goal. If your main goal is perhaps to improve reading comprehension, then reading as you listen or reading before you listen is not a problem. I'm assuming here that the goal is to improve listening specifically. But that is also what this episode is about, and that's what the question is about. So I just wanted to say that up front. When you want to improve your listening comprehension, you will find that it's not so easy to find good resources, and I've done my best to collect them in various articles on Hacking Chinese, and again I put links in the show notes, and in Fluent Listener there is a resource library that contains a lot more resources you can use, but either way, unless you're an advanced student, it's unlikely that you have too many good listening resources. There are many more good reading resources, however, so this is why I recommend you to listen before you read. You basically spoil the listening resource if you've read it in advance. This is no longer meaning-focused listening practice, but something else. And if improving listening ability is your main point, then you should focus on meaning-focused listening as much as possible. And this is when you listen to understand what someone is saying. You're not listening to, say, see how a grammar pattern is used or how a word is used, or indeed to see how a text you've already read is read aloud. In a way, you can think of this as communicative listening, even if it's only one way. You're listening with the goal of understanding what someone is saying. And to be able to do this, you need good listening resources at the right level. If they are too hard, you can no longer focus on meaning. You will get stuck in all the difficult words and things you didn't understand. But if the language is on the right level, you will be able to focus on the meaning. And when you're able to make these sound meaning connections, that's when you improve your listening comprehension. This process of connecting spoken forms to meaning doesn't stop the first time you listen though, and this is why I said you should listen more before you look at the transcript. This is a great way to get more out of the same resource and also a way to deal with resources that are slightly too hard for you. Because the first time you listen, it will be difficult, but if you listen twice, 3 times, or maybe 4 times, maybe more, then you will gradually understand more. And this process is immensely helpful for building listening ability in Mandarin. If you skip directly to the transcript, this process won't take place. You are seeing the meaning, and if your reading is already quite good, what you're doing here is you are still connecting forms of the language, in this case the written form of the language, with meaning, but that's not how you improve listening comprehension. That comes from associating spoken forms with meaning. It's hard to be precise here. How many times should you listen before you look at the transcript? Well, it could be once if you understand almost everything the first time. Maybe there was one thing you wanted to look up. Then fine, look at the transcript, no problem. But most likely, if you're a beginner or intermediate learner or even advanced learner, when you listen to more difficult things, there were many more things than just a single word that you didn't understand. And then I think that listening again makes sense. This doesn't necessarily mean that you should listen 100 times before looking at the transcript, because there is also an opportunity cost here. Each time you listen to something you've already listened to, you are not engaging with new content that might have taught you even more. And it can also be boring to listen to the same thing many times. The exception here is probably Chinese music. If you have a song you like, maybe you can listen to it hundreds of times, but it's unlikely that anybody listening to this will find it pleasurable to listen to a podcast episode 100 times. So in essence, stop before you get bored, stop when you think you understand most things already, and also stop when you feel that listening again doesn't add anything. There could just be that there are too many difficult words or grammar you don't know, and that's what's limiting you, and then listening again and again won't really help. This brings us to question number 2 from Cassandra, which is about advancing from B2 to C1. If you're not familiar with these letter and number combinations, they are levels in the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, and B2 is an upper intermediate level and C1 is advanced. So the question here is, if you are on an intermediate level and want to improve as quickly as possible, reaching an advanced level, how should you do that? And my answer here will actually apply to almost all levels, not specifically this one, but this is what the question is about. I already mentioned meaning-focused input in the previous question, and this is what you need, and you need a lot of it. Listening comprehension is to a very large extent about quantity. If you listen a lot, if you focus on meaning, and if you engage with the language, you will learn. It follows then that if you do this a lot, you will also learn faster. Cassandra wants to improve quickly. We're talking about months here, not years. And if you want to do something like that, you need to take learning Chinese very seriously and invest most of your time into it. And this means listening for many hours every day. If you're not that dedicated and have many other things to do, the same advice still applies, but obviously you can't listen for many hours a day, but you can still work on ramping up the amount of listening you're doing. In the Fluent Listener, there is a whole section about how to do this. So what strategies can you use to listen more and how can you fit this into a busy life and so on. So check out the course if you're interested in that. Now, listening comprehension is not only about how much you listen. I also mentioned meaning-focused input, which is more about how you listen, which is also covered in the course, by the way. But I think I said the most important things here already. You need to focus on meaning. You need to be able to make these sound meaning connections. And if you can engage with the spoken language in this way over time, you will learn a lot. This brings us to question number 3, which is from Charles, and he wants to know if there are any strategies for dealing with Chinese people speaking so quickly. This depends a little bit on what you mean by strategy. I mean, there are many ways of practicing listening comprehension to better prepare you for rapid speech. And there are then also maybe some things you can do in a conversation when you're talking with someone, such as simply asking them to speak more slowly. Although I don't think that's what Charles has in mind here, it's more about how you practice to make sure that you understand people who speak quickly. There are a few components to discuss here, and one of them is quantity, as I just discussed in the previous question, because if you've listened enough, you will be better at processing the language and doing so quickly. For example, if you've learned a word and then heard it maybe 10 times, this means you will probably be able to recognize it in context, but it could also be that you're not familiar enough with it to do that if the context is different from the one you learned it in. This is particularly true if you learned this word in one context and never heard it in another context ever again. A good example of this might be a word from your textbook that appears once, maybe in an exercise somewhere, but in essence it only appears once. So you've seen it in your textbook and maybe you listen to the text and that's it. And that is no guarantee at all that you will understand this word in a different context in a conversation. And this is true even if you got full marks on your 听写 or something like that. So the way forward here is quantity. Like I said, you need to have heard these words in dozens or hundreds of different sentences in different contexts and so on, while paying attention to meaning. This is the meaning-focused listening I've been talking about earlier. The only way you can do that is if you listen a lot and if you listen to things that you can largely understand. This is about comprehensible input, not just input. If you want to know more about comprehension-based methods for learning Chinese, there is a good series about this on Hacking Chinese, and I'll put a link in the show notes. The point here is that when the rate of speech goes up, you don't have time to think about what words mean. And if you've seen words just a few times, you do need time to connect them to the meaning you have stored in memory. But if you've heard them hundreds of times, this connection will be instant, and so you will be able to keep up. As I mentioned, there are several components, so just being good and quick at recalling information you have previously learned is just one of them. Another part here is top-down listening and listening strategies related to that, which is something we talked about in episode 121. In a nutshell, top-down listening is when you use prior information, maybe things you could guess based on context, maybe knowledge about the world or the person who's speaking and so on, to fill in blanks, guess, interpolate, extrapolate and so on, to try to figure out what someone means. It is not just about connecting sounds to meaning. You also need to combine this with what you expect and know and so on, and this is something that largely affects your ability to listen to rapid speech. And in fact, not just rapid speech, but also speech where the, say, connection is bad, or when somebody has an accent and so on. In all these situations, being really good at top-down listening will help. Naturally, none of these approaches is easy or fast. I mean, understanding rapidly spoken Mandarin is not easy in the first place, and there are no shortcuts which will just allow you to skip all this. You do need to listen a lot, and you need to build both your bottom-up and top-down listening skills. This means we've gone through all the questions, and if this type of discussion interests you, I'm sure you will find the Fluent Listener interesting and useful, because the course is essentially about answering these types of questions, but doing so very thoroughly. First by looking at what you're supposed to listen to, so the content, then by how you are supposed to listen, so which strategy should you use and so on, and then finally, how do you increase the amount of time that you listen? Because as we all know, simply saying that you want to listen more or do something more is usually not enough. All the questions I addressed in this Q&A, and probably also in almost all the previous Q&As about listening comprehension, are covered in the course. So do check it out. It's open for enrollment until Sunday next week. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.